Our reading this morning comes from the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, Ozymandias. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the hand that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch away." I invite us to sing again. You'll find it in the gray hymn number 163, "For the Earth Forever Turning." On April 15th in 2019, a fire broke out in the medieval French Cathedral of Notre Dame de Paris. It was devastating to witness. A huge conflagration of an ancient building that was both beautiful and a reflection of centuries of virtually invisible labor. More than 200 tons of toxic lead from the roof and spire was unaccounted for. So to do the work of reclamation in that space right now requires hazmat suits and suiting up an extraordinary amount of just even getting in the building. And the damage threatened the delicate balance of forces between the vault and the cathedral's flying buttresses, those famous ones that held up the walls. The entire building teetered on possible collapse. And yet, when the fire happened, modern historians and archaeologists suddenly had access to information about the 13th century that had been hidden in the very blocks of its walls, in the rings of its wooden beams. In order to be paid for their stone cutting work, 13th century stonecutters would etch their initials into the backs of the blocks that would be stacked to produce those storing walls, those initials that were invisible until fire gave us access. The stonecutters of Notre Dame's edifice could be tied now to other 13th century structures across Europe. Each stone brought out of anonymity, each stonemason brought out of obscurity. Now we might place our hands alongside the hands of no longer anonymous stonecutters whose tools brought this edifice into being. What we know is that despite what in our short lifetimes has felt like a static and permanent structure, the cathedral itself has already undergone extraordinary renaissances. While it is kilometer zero in France, holding a symbolic center as all roads and calculations take its location into account, over the centuries, its status has waxed and waned. In the 1800s, there was interest in demolishing the neglected and decaying cathedral with its dour Gothic architecture and replacing it with a Baroque building reflecting the favored design of the times. Victor Hugo took on its salvation when he published Notre Dame de Paris in 1831, and he generated renewed interest in the cathedral, and he prompted the king to reluctantly call for its refurbishment, generating new projects that altered its appearance into what 20th century visitors who saw it before 2019 thought of as its original form. The 750-ton spire that fell through the roof during the fire, that was added in the 1800s. While the gargoyles that operated as rain spouts had been original, they were designed, if they did their job properly, to be replaced every so often because rain and limestone used as gutters do not produce permanence. Every 100 years, they would need to be replaced. They were made to be ephemeral, to rot and erode and be reborn as needed. These are the things that we learn when we are faced with devastation. Anything that acts as a metaphor is more than just its bricks and mortar and oak beams. How we work with our metaphors is the source of their power. So if it's a metaphor that just makes us wallow or sit in sorrow, what good is it? If it's a metaphor that demands our attention and action, then it's useful. And so when faced with devastation, when faced with loss and confusion and chaos and an end to what we mistakenly tell ourselves is permanent, we have options. We can cry and grieve. We should cry and grieve. But what then? Once the tears have dried, can we allow ourselves to embrace the opportunities and insights on offer? As some of you know, I am originally from the Mountain West, from the land of thunderstorms and lightning strikes and ponderosa pine forests and fire-adapted ecosystems. Drought and wind and lightning and human fallibility produced regular fire seasons. Our forests were designed to burn, that they may emerge and evolve into new and needed habitat for a variety of species. On one of my father's first visits here to the vineyard, I took him on that road behind the high school, passing through the state forest, and his only words were, "This forest is so unhealthy." We have firsthand vineyard knowledge of that in what happens when we try to stop the natural world from engaging in its necessary processes. We need only look at the story of the extinction of our heath hen, herded into protected forest that we might save it, only to have the forest catch on fire as it was intended to do. Extinction. Forest fires, trees that require burning to grow, forests that require burning to get healthier. Sometimes we have to accept that burning might help us to regain a sense of purpose and grace and belonging to something bigger than ourselves. This is what we've lost, the belonging to our world. We have felt at odds with our neighbors, at odds with our climate, at odds with our sense of normalcy. Nothing feels as safe or as secure as we remember, although it is important to note that this security was both a lie and a hallmark of privilege. But as humans with lifespans that when placed next to geological eras appear as brief as lightning bug illuminations on humid summer evenings, we still find it hard to grapple with finitude, with impermanence, with the fact that things change, that we will die, and the institutions that we think of as permanent must change too. Even when we are faced with proof of this fallacy, we struggle to give it up. We think things will remain the way they always have been in the span that we have been witnessing it. We have always had our cathedrals, man-made and otherwise, and we have always been forced to reckon with their loss. In Marge Piercy's essay, Homesick, she describes the landscape of Cape Cod over the ages. The colonists found beech and oak trees high as steeples and chopped them down, so that when Thoreau hiked from Sandwich outward, he crossed a desert, for they had farmed the land until it blew away. When the fire happens over centuries, do we experience it as a loss or see it as a process? Does time bind our wounds or fail to inflict them entirely? Our worship theme this month is belonging. What, you may be asking, does all of this musing have to do with any of that? In part, I want to suggest that we delude ourselves into believing that we belong if something is static. That we need belonging, we need something static to be experiencing that sense of belonging. We need something that is impervious to change. That if we belong to the landscape, then it must remain recognizable to us in order for us to feel that connection. That the landmarks of our lives must remain stable and whole in order for us to maintain a sense of belonging. So that something happens that gives us that feeling of irreparable loss, something that provided a comforting sense of belonging to the human race, to our unity, to our collective history of extraordinary works. I'm using Notre Dame here as a stand-in because there are so many things that are lost or threatened if that loss feels permanent. Sacred sites of those who are indigenous, whose own cathedrals have been bulldozed or are threatened by extinction through resource extraction. The earth itself, with its forest cathedrals and stained glass glaciers, threatened by human ignorance and wanton consumption. All of that. And then we have this pandemic that just hit, and here we are justifiably asking whether something irreparable has occurred. We look out and we wonder at our civic world, the national zeitgeist, this sense of loss that feels both pervasive and without end. Do we think we can fix this? The only way that we can be made whole is to allow ourselves to be broken open, to let the ceiling fall in and look at the floor again, to recognize that change is a part of how we move forward as people, and recognize that we will never feel a sense of belonging if we cannot inscribe our own initials on the blocks that go back into the building. Where do your initials belong in our new world, in our rebuilt world? Not as an act of individualism. These are initials that are designed to be hidden inside the walls of the extraordinary structures that we will lend our efforts to build. And I'm not talking about cathedrals either. I'm talking about community and democracy and justice, efforts so grand that they require all of us to take part, and they will not be achieved in our lifetimes, and that's okay. We are rebuilding something that has not happened yet. The National Geographic photographer who was tasked with taking photographs of the interior of Notre Dame as it was being rebuilt flew a drone, and it was very hard for him to get permission to do this. And he talked about how here was this place where everything happened in France. It was where Napoleon crowned himself, or the French revolutionaries came in and blacked out the windows and turned it into a temple of reason instead of a church. It's a place that's been through the movements of time and history, and he says, and yet it continues. And it continues because people care about it. People add to it. People are inspired by it. They care about it. They add to it and are inspired by it. This is what Ozymandias neglected in his zeal for personal immortality. Monuments, projects of ego and power, if they do not carry with them the capacity to inspire future generations to claim a sense of belonging, they will be stumps of marble crumbled to the ground. If they don't invite future generations to carve their own visions onto the original, it is decay. It is a colossal wreck. So, how does spiritual community relate to that? Against that context, what does it mean to reclaim or rebuild anything? Are we who seek religious community modern-day Ozymandiases certain of our lasting worth, even as we doom ourselves to irrelevance? What makes someone want to contribute to something? It has to begin by recognizing that evolution within that thing is possible. That change is possible, not just possible, desired, needed, craved. Ozymandias' temple to himself has no opportunity for revisioning. But if each successive generation is invited into transformation, that's how institutions are built to survive over time. And that's the only way that institutions ever invite self-transformation. And those are the communities that we must seek to build after devastation. How do you get a sense of belonging when you are the first stonemason on Notre Dame, chipping your initials into the back so you can get paid? If things are already in motion, how do you get to a place of belonging? You have to think bigger. You are part of something bigger. You are part of human history. And if there's no space for you within that continuity of human history, there is no capacity for you to think that you can make a difference, that you belong to the project of making a difference, then what we are doing here is useless. And exploiting division will probably not build cathedrals, and it certainly will not rebuild cathedrals. Beloveds, we are the inheritors of something so beautiful and fragile and finite, and something so strong and enduring that with change was written into it in its very blueprint, its first imagining. And like communities and marriages and political systems and cultural icons and churches and ecosystems, none of it continues without our efforts, hidden though they may be. They take work. They demand an adherence to the importance of change, the power of change, whether that be fast and cataclysmic or slow over time. We are inheritors and stewards and stonecutters and visionaries, and the future we want for our children and their children rests in our hands. Look at your hands. These are the ones that need to do the work. Our inclination to roll up our sleeves and do work we would never have imagined was necessary is where we find ourselves right now. This is how we know we belong to a great span of time, to a great experiment of human ingenuity and dreaming. The initials that we hide in the walls are our claim of belonging. No single person built Notre Dame. No single person saved it, no matter how much we place at the feet of the French novelist. No single person grew a forest. We are the seeds in the pine cone forged through fire. And maybe we're scared. when we look out at this broken world that needs us. I know I'm scared. I'm daunted. Maybe it feels too big and too broken and too lost to the ravages of fire, but it was made to be big. And it was made to be broken. And it was even made to be set ablaze. We can count down if we need to rally our strength and our energy. We can shake our world into action. We may need to give ourselves time to grieve what was, if we are to become what is to become. Or we can start right now, out of the ashes, aware of our impermanence and the impermanence all around us, eager to etch those initials that signal our place in the breathtaking span of creation. May it be so. Amen.